Wood has a memory, not the kind of memory that recalls events or stores information, but a physical memory, a tendency to return to a previous state, to move in response to changes in moisture and temperature, to twist and check and split and warp along the grain lines that were established when the tree was alive and growing. A freshly felled log contains between 30 and 80% moisture by weight, depending on the species and the season. This moisture is held in two places: in the cell cavities, where it sits as free water like water in a glass, and in the cell walls themselves, where it is bound at a molecular level to the cellulose fibers that give wood its structure. When a log dries, the free water in the cell cavities evaporates first, and this causes no dimensional change. The log weighs less, but it does not shrink. The problems begin when the free water is gone, and the bound water in the cell walls begins to leave. This is called the fiber saturation point, and it occurs at approximately 28% moisture content in most softwood species. Below this point, as bound water leaves the cell walls, the cells physically shrink. They contract laterally, across the grain, not along it, and this contraction is uneven because the cells on the outside of the log dry faster than the cells in the center. The outside shrinks while the inside remains swollen, and this differential creates internal stress that the wood relieves in the only way it can: by cracking. These cracks are called checks, and they radiate from the surface toward the center of the log in patterns that follow the weakest lines in the grain structure. And once they open, they never fully close because the wood on either side of the check has permanently changed shape. A checked log is a compromised log. Every check is a pathway for water to enter the heartwood, and water in the heartwood is the beginning of rot. A cabin built with green logs, logs that were felled and built with immediately, as most frontier cabins were, will check within the first year as the logs dry in place. The checks open during the dry months of summer and partially close during the wet months of autumn, and with each cycle they deepen slightly, and water enters during the wet phase and does not fully leave during the dry phase, and the slow process of fungal decay begins in the damp heartwood behind the check. A green-built cabin in New Hampshire, where the humidity is high and the freeze-thaw cycles are brutal, will show significant checking within 2 years, visible rot within 5 to 8, and structural compromise within 15 to 20. This is not a defect in the wood. This is the physics of drying, and it applies to every log in every cabin built green on every frontier in every climate. And there is nothing the builder can do about it after the cabin is standing, because the checking happens from inside the log outward and cannot be prevented by any surface treatment or exterior coating. The freeze-thaw cycle compounds the damage in ways that settlers in milder climates never experienced. When water enters a check during autumn rain, it penetrates the crack and sits in the heartwood. When the temperature drops below 32 degrees, the water freezes. Water expands by approximately 9% when it freezes, and this expansion pushes the walls of the check apart from the inside, widening the crack by a fraction of a millimeter. When the ice thaws, the crack does not close back to its original width because the wood fibers on either side of the check have been permanently displaced. The next freeze widens it further. Each cycle, freeze, expand, thaw, hold, drives the check deeper and wider. And after 5 years of New Hampshire winters, where the temperature crosses the freezing point dozens of times between November and April, a check that started as a hairline crack on the surface has become a fissure that runs halfway to the center of the log and is wide enough to accept a knife blade. This is the mechanism by which frost destroys wooden structures, and it operates on every checked log, in every cabin, in every climate where winter temperatures cross the freezing point, which is to say most of North America. The only defense against frost checking is to prevent the initial checks from forming. And the only way to prevent the initial checks from forming is to ensure that the logs have already reached their stable moisture content before they are built with, so that the differential drying that causes checks does not occur after the cabin is standing, unless the logs are seasoned before they are built with. And this is where the story begins. There are two ways to season timber. The common way, the way that every American frontier settler understood, was air drying. You felled the logs, stacked them off the ground on skids with spacers between each log for air circulation, and you waited. In New England, air drying a softwood log to a stable moisture content below 20% took between 1 and 2 years, depending on the diameter of the log and the weather. For hardwood, oak, maple, beech, it took 2 to 3 years. This was time that most homesteaders did not have. A family that arrived in the spring needed a cabin by October. They could not wait 2 years for their logs to dry, so they built green, and the logs checked, and the cabins settled unevenly, and the chinking cracked and fell out and had to be replaced every year, and the corners opened gaps as the logs shrank, and after 15 or 20 years, the cabin was drafty and leaking and beginning to rot, and the family either rebuilt or patched endlessly or simply lived with the cold air coming through the walls. The second way to season timber was water curing, submerging freshly felled logs in water, a creek, a pond, a purpose-built log pond, for a period of 6 months to 2 years before drying them. This technique was not American. It was European, practiced in the forested regions of Central Europe, Scandinavia, and the British Isles for centuries. The Bohemian timber workers of the Šumava forest, the great wooded mountain range along the border between Bohemia and Bavaria, had been water-curing timber since the Middle Ages. They called the practice vodní sezení, water sitting. And every timber framer in the Šumava knew it as a fundamental step in producing building-grade lumber. You did not build with green wood. You did not build with air-dried wood. You built with water-cured wood, and if someone asked you why, you showed them a cabin that was 80 years old and still tight at the corners, while the cabin next to it, built with air-dried timber 30 years earlier, was already sagging and checked and halfway to collapse. The science behind water curing is counterintuitive but straightforward. When a freshly felled log is submerged in running water, several things happen simultaneously. First, the running water dissolves and carries away the sugars, starches, and sap compounds stored in the sapwood. These compounds are what insects and fungi feed on. A green log sitting on the ground is a buffet for powder post beetles, bark beetles, carpenter ants, and dozens of species of wood decay fungi. A log submerged in a creek is inaccessible to insects and is being actively stripped of the nutrients that fungi need. After 6 months in running water, the sapwood of a spruce or hemlock log has lost the majority of its soluble sugars, and when the log is removed and dried, it is far less attractive to biological decay organisms than a log that was air-dried with all its sugars intact. Second, the water replaces the sap in the cell structure with clean water. Sap is a complex solution of sugars, minerals, and organic compounds that behaves differently during drying than pure water does. Sap can crystallize, can create sticky deposits that interfere with even drying, can attract insects, and can stain the wood. Clean water does none of these things. A water-cured log that has had its sap replaced with creek water dries more evenly and more predictably than a green log drying with its original sap still in the cells. Third, and most importantly, the prolonged submersion allows the wood to undergo a slow chemical change in the cell walls. The tannins and lignin compounds in the cell walls partially cross-link in the presence of water over time, creating a denser, more dimensionally stable cell structure. This is not a dramatic change. It is subtle, measurable only with precise instruments, but its effect on the finished timber is significant. A water-cured log, once dried, shrinks less than an air-dried log of the same species. It checks less. It warps less. It holds its shape more reliably across seasonal humidity changes. The dimensional stability of water-cured timber versus green or air-dried timber is the difference between a cabin that stays tight for 30 years and a cabin that starts opening up after 3. Andrzej Kovács knew all of this. He had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had worked the Šumava timber stands for the Schwarzenberg estate in southern Bohemia, floating logs down the Vltava River to Prague for the construction trade. 3 generations of Kovács men had felled trees, dragged them to the river, and floated them downstream to the timber yards where they sat in the water for months or years before being pulled out and sawn into building lumber. Andrzej had grown up understanding that water and wood had a relationship that most people misunderstood. Most people thought water was the enemy of wood. They thought water caused rot, caused swelling, caused decay. And they were right in the way that someone who says fire is dangerous is right. It is true, but it is not the whole truth. Water causes rot in wood that is intermittently wet and dry, because the wet-dry cycle is what fungi need to grow. Wood that is kept continuously wet does not rot, because the fungi that cause decay require oxygen, and wood submerged in water has no oxygen in its cells. And wood that has been properly water-cured and then thoroughly dried does not rot easily either, because the sugars that feed decay organisms have been washed away, and the cell structure has been stabilized by the curing process. Water is the enemy of wood only when it is applied carelessly. Applied deliberately, with knowledge and patience, water is the single most effective treatment for producing timber that lasts. Andrzej arrived in New Hampshire in the spring of 1882 with Bela and $23 and a set of hand-forged timber framing tools, a broadaxe, a felling axe, a draw knife, an adze, and a 2-man cross-cut saw that had belonged to his father and his father before that. They settled in a valley in the White Mountain foothills, in a cluster of homesteads along a creek that the locals called Alder Run for the dense stands of alder that grew along its banks. The land was steep and heavily forested, and the creek ran cold and clear through the valley bottom, fed by mountain springs that kept it flowing even in the driest summers. Andrzej looked at the creek and saw what his father would have seen, a curing facility. A slow, deep bend where the water pooled to a depth of 4 feet, with a gravel bottom and a steady current that would carry away dissolved sap compounds without being so fast that it would roll the logs. A perfect place to cure timber. He spent the first summer in a temporary shelter, a lean-to of poles and bark that kept the rain off but not the cold. And he spent that summer felling spruce and hemlock from the hillside above the homestead. He felled the trees in June, which Bela had specified. This was her contribution, and it was not a small one. In Bohemia, the Kovács family had always felled timber for water curing during the period of bark slip. The weeks in late spring and early summer when the sap is running at its peak and the bark separates easily from the wood beneath. During bark slip, You can peel the bark from a freshly felled log with a draw knife in long, clean strips with minimal effort, because the cambium layer between bark and wood is saturated with sap and has almost no adhesion. Outside of bark slip season, in autumn or winter, the bark bonds tightly to the wood and must be hacked off in small pieces with an axe, which is slow, exhausting work that damages the surface of the log. Bela had watched the local trees carefully through the spring of 1882 and identified the bark slip window for New Hampshire spruce as approximately June 1st through June 20th. And she told Andrzej that all felling for the cabin must happen within this window. Andrzej felled 19 spruce trees and 4 hemlock trees in 18 days, and he and Bela peeled every one of them on the same day they were felled, while the bark was still loose, using the draw knife that had peeled logs in the Šumava for 3 generations. The bark came off in long curling strips, revealing the pale wet sapwood beneath, and Bela stacked the bark strips to dry for later use as roofing material beneath the shingles. The peeled logs went into the creek. Andrzej rolled them down the bank and into the deep bend, where he anchored them with heavy stones and cross stakes driven into the gravel bottom to keep them from floating downstream in high water. The logs sat fully submerged, the cold, clear creek water flowing over and around them, dissolving the sugars in the sapwood, replacing the sap with clean water, beginning the slow chemical process of curing that would take 12 months to complete. Gideon Cragg saw the logs in the creek within a week. Cragg owned the sawmill 4 miles downstream, and he sold lumber to every homesteader in the valley at $12 per 1,000 board feet for rough-cut spruce. He was a lean, sharp-faced man in his 50s who had built the mill himself and ran it with his 2 sons, and he understood wood the way a merchant understands wood, as a product to be cut, sold, and replaced. He did not understand wood the way Andrzej understood it, which was as a living material with properties that could be manipulated by treatment. Cragg saw the logs in the creek and told Andrzej he was ruining them. He said the water would saturate the wood and make it impossible to dry. He said the logs would swell and soften and turn punky and gray and be fit for nothing but firewood. He said he had been in the lumber business for 25 years, and he had never seen anyone deliberately put good logs in a creek and leave them there. And he said all of this with the confident authority of a man who has been wrong about something for so long that he has mistaken his wrongness for expertise. Andrzej listened. He nodded. He said nothing. The logs stayed in the creek. Radek Havlik, a Czech neighbor who had arrived in the valley 2 years before the Kovars, understood what Andrzej was doing. Havlik was not a timberman. He was a blacksmith from Plzeň. But he had grown up in Bohemia, and he knew that vodní sezení was standard practice in the Šumava, and he told the other settlers that the Czech was not ruining his logs, he was curing them, and that the cabin he built with those logs would outlast every cabin in the valley. The other settlers listened to Havlik with the politeness that people extend to a man who is defending his countrymen, and they did not believe him, because they could see the logs in the creek with their own eyes, and the logs looked like logs that were being ruined. If you want to know what happened when Andrzej Kovář brought 3 generations of Bohemian timber knowledge to a New Hampshire valley, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The logs stayed in the creek for 13 months. Andrzej checked them periodically, wading into the cold water, running his hands along the surface of the submerged logs, pressing his thumbnail into the end grain to test the firmness. The checking was not casual. It was a systematic evaluation that followed a schedule his father had taught him. At 3 months, the sapwood should feel the same as when it went in, firm and smooth, with no soft spots. Softness at 3 months meant the log had a defect that the water was exploiting rather than curing, and it should be pulled and discarded. At 6 months, the sapwood should have changed color from pale cream to a warm golden tan, which told him the sugars were leaching out and the tannins from the creek water were beginning to penetrate the outer fibers. If the color had not changed, the water flow was too slow, or the log was positioned wrong. The current needed to flow across the full length of the log, not just the ends. At 9 months, the surface should feel subtly different when rubbed with the thumb. Smoother, denser, as if the grain had tightened. This was the beginning of the lignin cross-linking, the chemical change in the cell walls that would give the finished timber its dimensional stability. At 12 months, the log should feel ready, firm throughout, uniformly golden tan in the sapwood, with no soft spots, no discoloration, no smell of decay. After 13 months, André pulled a log from the creek, split it with a maul, and examined the cross-section. The sapwood was golden brown throughout, firm, with a faint smell of clean tannin and wet stone. The heartwood was unchanged, still the pale rose pink of fresh spruce. But the sapwood, which is the layer most vulnerable to decay, had been transformed by 13 months of continuous water exposure into a denser, harder, more decay-resistant material than it had been as a living tree. The boundary between sapwood and heartwood was clearly visible in the cross-section, a distinct color change from golden brown to rose pink. And the sapwood, which in a green log would have been soft enough to dent with a thumbnail, was now hard enough to resist the same pressure. André was satisfied. He pulled the logs from the creek. Pulling the logs was heavy work. Each log, waterlogged after 13 months, weighed approximately twice what it had weighed when it went in. A 12-inch spruce log 16 feet long that had weighed roughly 400 pounds green now weighed close to 800 pounds saturated. André used a peavey and a rope and pulley arrangement anchored to a stump to roll the logs up the creek bank one at a time, and the work took 3 days for 23 logs. Bela helped by guiding the logs with a peavey from the waterside while André hauled from the bank. It was exhausting, cold, wet work. The creek was still running cold from the mountain springs, even in July. And at the end of 3 days, they had a stack of waterlogged logs on the bank that would need 3 months to dry. The drying took 3 months. André stacked the logs on skids 6 inches off the ground, with 2-inch spacers between each log for air circulation, on a south-facing slope where the sun hit the stack from morning to afternoon. The elevation off the ground was important. Logs stacked directly on the earth would absorb ground moisture from below and dry unevenly. The spacers were important. Without air circulation between the logs, the surfaces in contact with each other would stay wet while the exposed surfaces dried, creating the same differential drying stress that causes checking. The south-facing orientation was important. Consistent sun exposure from one direction meant the stack dried evenly from one side, and André rotated the logs once during the drying period at the 6-week mark, turning each log so that the side that had been facing down was now facing up. The logs dried slowly and evenly, the moisture leaving the wood at a rate controlled by the air temperature and humidity rather than by direct sun, which would have dried the outer surface too fast and caused the same differential stress that produces checking in green logs. By October, the logs had reached a moisture content of approximately 18%. which Andrzej tested by weighing a section of a sacrificial log on a scale and comparing it to the weight of the same section after baking it in the cook stove until it stopped losing weight. The dried weight divided by the baked weight gave the moisture content, and 18% was well below the fiber saturation point of 28% and within the range of dimensional stability. The logs were ready to build with. The cabin went up in October and November of 1883. Andrzej built it alone except for the ridge beam, which required 4 men to lift into place, and Radek Havlik and 2 other neighbors came to help with that single task. The construction was traditional Bohemian timber framing, full dovetail notches at the corners, which Andrzej cut with an axe and a chisel to tolerances of less than 1/4 inch, each notch angled so that gravity pulled the joint tighter rather than allowing it to spread. The dovetail was not a decorative choice. It was an engineering choice. A saddle notch, which was the standard corner joint on most American frontier cabins, allows the log to shrink away from the notch as it dries, opening a gap that lets air and water in. A dovetail notch locks the logs together in a way that tightens as the wood settles, because the angled faces of the dovetail press harder against each other under the weight of the logs above. In a green-built cabin, even a dovetail notch eventually shows gaps because the dimensional change from drying is so large that it overwhelms the mechanical advantage of the joint. In a cabin built with pre-seasoned logs, the dovetail locks permanently because the logs have already reached their stable dimensions and the joint faces will not move. The logs were hewn flat on 2 faces with the broadaxe, giving a wall thickness of 7 inches, and chinked with a mixture of clay, lime, and chopped moss pressed into the joints with a flat wooden tool called a fugue iron. The chinking mixture was Andrzej's own formulation, adapted from the Bohemian practice of using clay and lime with horsehair as a binder. In New Hampshire, horsehair was expensive, but chopped sphagnum moss was free and served the same purpose. The fibers prevented the chinking from cracking as it dried by distributing the shrinkage stress across thousands of tiny reinforcing strands, the same way rebar prevents concrete from cracking. The lime in the mixture made it slightly alkaline, which discouraged mold growth in the damp joints, and the clay provided bulk and plasticity. Andrzej mixed the chinking to a consistency that held its shape when pressed into the joint, but was soft enough to conform to every irregularity in the log surface, and he applied it with the fugue iron, a flat, narrow piece of hardwood shaped like a wide chisel, pressing it firmly into the joint and smoothing the surface so that water would run across it rather than pooling against it. The cabin was 16 feet by 22 feet, 1 story with a sleeping loft, a stone hearth chimney on the east wall, a plank door on the south face, and 2 small windows with oiled paper. The total material cost, excluding the logs which came from Andrzej's own land, was $11.40. $6 for the plank door and window frames milled at Cragg's sawmill, $3.20 for lime, 70 cents for oiled paper, and $1.50 for hardware, including hinges, a latch, and nails for the roof boards. The roof was rough-sawn spruce planks covered with birch bark sheets, saved from the peeling of the wall logs, and a top layer of hand-split cedar shingles. The total construction time from first log to finished cabin was 38 days of work for 1 man, not counting the single day when 4 men raised the ridge beam. Nettie Farnham, who lived on the next homestead downstream, came to look at the cabin when it was nearly finished. Nettie was a practical Vermont-born woman married to a farmer named Orville Farnham, and she had lived in log cabins her entire life. She ran her hand along the interior wall and said the wood felt different from any cabin she had been in. She was right. The surface of the water-cured logs was harder and smoother than green-built logs because the curing process had densified the sapwood, and the slow, controlled drying had prevented the surface crazing that occurs when green wood dries too fast. The logs had a warm golden brown color rather than the pale gray that spruce normally weathers to, because the tannins absorbed from the creek water had penetrated the outer fibers and created a natural stain that also happened to be mildly antifungal. The joints between the logs were tight, not the loose gapped joints of a green-built cabin where the logs have shrunk away from the chinking, but tight joints where the pre-seasoned logs had already done their shrinking before they were built with, and the chinking was seated against stable surfaces that would not pull away. The first winter tested the cabin the way every first winter tests every new cabin in New Hampshire, and the covage cabin passed. The chinking held, the corners stayed tight, the logs did not check. Not a single radial crack appeared on any log surface, interior or exterior, through the entire first winter. This alone was remarkable. Every other cabin in the valley had shown checks within its first year, some within the first 3 months, because the green logs were drying in place and the differential shrinkage was splitting the surface open. The covage logs had nothing left to shrink. They had reached their stable moisture content during the 3 months of controlled drying on the hillside, and the dimensional changes that produced checking had already occurred before the logs were ever stacked in the wall. The interior temperature, maintained by a fire in the stone hearth, was noticeably warmer than the Farnham cabin next door, not because the covage cabin had better insulation, but because it had fewer air leaks. Every gap in a wall is a pathway for cold air, and a green-built cabin develops dozens of gaps in the first winter as the logs shrink and the chinking cracks, and each gap lets cold air in and warm air out, and the settler burns more wood to compensate. The covage cabin had almost no gaps because the logs had already reached their stable dimensions before they were stacked, and the chinking was seated against surfaces that did not move. André measured the difference with a candle test, holding a lit candle close to the wall joints on a windy day and watching for the flame to flicker. In the Farnham cabin, the candle flickered at 7 joints on the north wall alone. In the covage cabin, the candle burned steady at every joint. 0 air leaks on the north wall. 0 on any wall. Gideon Cragg came by in March of 1884 after the first winter. He looked at the walls. He looked at the corners. He pressed his thumbnail into the log surface and felt the hardness. He did not say anything about the creek logs rotting. He asked how long the logs had been in the water. André told him. 13 months. Cragg asked why. André explained. The sugars, the sap replacement, the dimensional stability, the reduced checking. Cragg listened with the expression of a man who is hearing something that contradicts 25 years of assumptions and is not enjoying the experience. He left without commenting further. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families warm and dry for generations deserves to be remembered. The second winter confirmed what the first winter had suggested. The chinking held. No checks appeared. The corners remained tight. Orville Farnham's cabin, built green in 1879 with good spruce from Cragg's mill, was showing visible checks on the south-facing wall, some of them 3/8 of an inch wide and running the full length of the log, and the chinking between 2 corner logs had cracked and fallen out entirely and needed to be replaced. Farnham replaced it. It would crack again the following winter, because the logs were still moving, still slowly reaching an equilibrium moisture content that they would not achieve for another 3 to 4 years. And every movement opened the joints and cracked the chinking and let the cold in. By the 5th year, 1888, the difference between the Covage cabin and every other cabin in the valley was visible to anyone who looked. 5 years of New Hampshire weather, 5 cycles of freeze and thaw, 5 summers of humidity, and 5 winters of dry cold, 5 years of wood moving and settling and checking and splitting had aged the green-built cabins significantly. Farnham's cabin had 17 visible checks on the exterior walls, 3 of them deep enough to accept a knife blade to the hilt. Gideon Cragg's own house, built with his own mill lumber in 1866, had been re-chinked twice and still showed gaps at 2 corners where the logs had twisted as they dried. Orville Sutter, who had built a large cabin with green hemlock in 1880, had already replaced 4 logs on the north wall where checking had allowed water penetration, and the heartwood had rotted to the point of structural weakness. The Covage cabin had 0 checks. None. Not a single radial crack on any log, interior or exterior. The chinking was intact on every joint. The corners were as tight as the day they were cut. The wood had weathered to a deep warm brown, darker than the gray-white that untreated spruce weathers too, and the surface was hard enough that André's thumbnail left no mark when he pressed it against the wall. The tannin-stained sapwood had developed a natural patina that shed water rather than absorbing it, and the absence of checks meant there were no pathways for water to enter the heartwood, which meant the interior of every log was as sound as the day it was hewn. The firewood savings were measurable and consistent. In the first 5 winters, the Covars burned an average of 3.5 cords per year. The Farnhams, with a cabin of similar size built green, burned an average of 4 3/4. The difference of 1 1/4 cords per winter was $5 in purchased wood, or 5 days of cutting labor, and it was entirely attributable to the tighter construction of the water-cured cabin. Fewer gaps meant less cold air infiltration, which meant less heat loss, which meant less wood burned to maintain the same interior temperature. Over 10 years, the cumulative firewood savings were 12.5 cords, which represented $50 or 50 days of cutting labor. Over 30 years, the savings were 37.5 cords, $150 and 150 days of labor that André did not spend swinging an axe in sub-zero cold. The savings compounded in ways that were not immediately obvious. A family that burned less firewood did not simply save the cost of the wood. They saved the time that would have been spent cutting it, which they could use for other productive work. They saved the physical wear on the man who did the cutting. 5 fewer days per winter swinging an axe in sub-zero cold was 5 fewer days of exposure to frostbite, injury, and exhaustion. They saved the wear on the tools. Fewer hours of use meant less frequent sharpening and longer tool life. And they saved the standing timber that would have been cut for firewood, which could instead be cut for lumber, for fencing, or left standing as windbreak. The water-cured cabin was not just a better house. It was a more efficient economic unit, a structure that demanded less from the land and the people who lived on it, and returned more in comfort and durability per dollar and per hour invested. The 10th year, 1893, was when the skeptics stopped arguing and started asking questions. A decade of New Hampshire winters had separated the cabins in the valley into 2 categories, those that were aging well and those that were not. Every green-built cabin was in the second category. Every one of them had been re-chinked at least once. Every one of them showed checking. Several had replaced logs. Farnham had spent a total of approximately $40 on chinking materials and replacement lumber over 10 years, plus uncounted hours of labor. Sutter had spent even more, $60 by his own estimate, including the cost of 6 replacement logs from Cragg's mill. The covage cabin had required 0 maintenance on the walls, 0 re-chinking, 0 log replacement, and $0 spent on repairs in 10 years. The economics of water curing, which had seemed impractical when Andrzej was sinking logs in the creek, who has time to wait 15 months for lumber, now looked like the most practical decision anyone in the valley had ever made. 15 months of patience in 1882 and 1883 had saved 10 years of maintenance, $40 to $60 in repair costs, and hundreds of hours of labor that Andrzej spent on farming and furniture making and tool repair, while his neighbors were up on ladders re-chinking their walls. The total cost comparison was devastating to the conventional approach. A green-built cabin of the same size as the covage cabin, using lumber from Cragg's mill at $12 per 1,000 board feet, cost approximately $45 in materials to build and required an average of $6 per year in maintenance over the first 10 years. Re-chinking supplies, replacement logs, hardware to reinforce loosened corners. That was $105 over 10 years. The covage cabin cost $11.40 in materials, required 0 maintenance over 10 years, and used logs that Andrzej felled from his own land, cured in a creek that ran through the valley for free, and dried on a hillside that cost nothing. The difference was not marginal, it was an order of magnitude, and it did not account for the labor savings, which were even more significant than the dollar savings, because labor on the frontier was the scarcest resource of all. Every hour spent re-chinking a wall was an hour not spent clearing land, tending crops, cutting hay, or earning wages. The covage family had 10 years of those hours back. Nettie Farnham asked Andrzej to show Orville how to water cure timber. She did not ask politely. She asked in the way that a woman asks when she has spent 10 years watching her husband re-chink a cabin that should not need re-chinking, while the cabin next door sits there looking exactly as it did the day it was built. Andrzej agreed. He took Orville to the creek bend where the curing logs had sat 11 years earlier and showed him the site. The stakes were still in the gravel. The stones Andrzej had used to anchor the logs were still there. He explained the process step by step. Fell during bark slip, June 1st through June 20th. Peel the same day. Roll into the creek the same day. Never let the peeled logs sit in the air, because the exposed sapwood begins to dry and check within hours. Submerge fully. Anchor with stones and stakes. Leave for 12 months minimum. Pull in early summer. Stack on skids with spacers, south-facing slope. Dry for 3 months. Test moisture content. Build when below 20%. Bela showed Nettie the bark slip test. You made a shallow cut through the bark with a knife and tried to peel back a strip. If it came off clean in a long ribbon, bark slip was on and the tree could be felled. If it stuck and tore, it was too early or too late. The window was narrow, 2 to 3 weeks at most, and missing it meant waiting another year. This was why Bela's contribution was critical. She had identified the exact timing for New Hampshire species, which was different from the timing in Bohemia because the growing season was different, and she had tested it by cutting small branches from several species every few days through the spring until she found the dates when the bark released cleanly. Without her timing, Andrzej would have felled at the wrong time and spent weeks hacking bark off with an axe instead of minutes peeling it with a draw knife, and the extra time and effort would have made the technique impractical for a single family to execute in one season. Farnham cured his first batch of logs in the summer of 1894. He felled 12 spruce during bark slip, peeled them the same day with Nettie helping on the draw knife. She turned out to be faster at peeling than Orville, her strokes cleaner and more consistent, and she peeled 6 of the 12 logs herself and rolled them into the creek and anchored them. He checked them periodically through the following year, wading into the creek in every season to run his hands along the submerged surfaces, the way Andre had shown him, feeling for softness, pressing his thumbnail into the end grain. At first, the checks felt pointless. The wood felt like wood, wet wood in a creek, indistinguishable from any other wet wood. But by the 8th month, he could feel the change. The sapwood was firmer. The surface had a different texture, smoother, denser, as if the wood had tightened in the water. The color had shifted from pale cream to a warm tan that was visible even through the dark creek water. In August of 1895, he pulled them out and stacked them to dry on skids on the same south-facing slope that Andre had used, with 2-inch spacers between each log. By November, they were ready, and he used them to replace the 6 worst logs in his cabin, the ones with deep checks and the beginnings of rot. The replacement was not a simple job. Removing a checked and rotted log from an occupied cabin without disturbing the logs above and below, it required jacking the wall, cutting the old log free at the corner notches, sliding it out, sliding the new log in, recutting the corner notches to match the existing joints, and releasing the jacks so the wall settled back onto the new log. Andre supervised the work, showing Farnham how to scribe the dovetail notch with a pair of wing dividers so that the new log mated precisely with the old notch above, and how to use the fugue iron to re-chink the joints with the lime clay moss mixture. The job took 4 days for 6 logs, and when it was done, the replacement logs were visibly different from the originals. They were harder, darker, smoother, and when Farnham chinked the joints, the chinking seated against surfaces that did not move. 5 years later, the replacement logs still showed no checks, while the remaining green-built logs continued to deteriorate around them. Nettie told Bela that every time she looked at those 6 smooth, dark logs sitting among the gray-checked originals, she wished they had known about the creek 30 years earlier. Gideon Cragg adapted in 1896. He did not adopt water curing for his sawmill lumber. The 12-month curing time was incompatible with the pace of his business, and his customers wanted lumber now, not in a year. But he began offering air-dried lumber as a premium product, stacking green-cut lumber in covered racks for 6 months before selling it at a 50% markup. It was not as good as water-cured timber. Air-dried logs still retained their sugars and were still vulnerable to insects and still checked more than water-cured logs. But it was better than green lumber, and Cragg was honest enough to admit, privately, that the Czech had been right about the creek. He told Andre this one evening at the Farnham cabin over coffee, in the halting way that proud men admit they were wrong. He did not say, "I was wrong" directly, but he said, "I did not understand what the water was doing," which amounted to the same thing, and Andre nodded and said nothing, because a nod was enough, and Andre had never held the disagreement against him. Cragg's premium air-dried lumber sold well. Families who had watched their green-built cabins deteriorate were willing to pay $18 per 1,000 board feet instead of $12 for lumber that would last longer, and Cragg's air-drying racks became a permanent fixture at the mill, covered structures with good ventilation that held several thousand board feet at various stages of drying. The oldest stock always sold first. By 1900, 5 families in the valley had water-cured timber in their buildings, either new construction or replacement logs. The technique spread slowly because it required patience. 12 months of curing plus 3 months of drying meant 15 months between felling and building, and most families could not afford to wait that long for their first cabin. But for families who were expanding, rebuilding, or adding outbuildings, the technique was practical and the results were undeniable. The water-cured logs in the valley were identifiable at a glance, darker, smoother, harder than the gray-white checked logs that surrounded them, and they were aging at a rate that made the green-built timber look like a different species. 2 types of wood, 2 rates of decay, 1 creek, and 13 months between them. The covage cabin stood for 30 years without a single log being replaced. 30 years of New Hampshire winters, 30 cycles of freeze and thaw, 30 seasons of snow load and ice dam and driving rain and summer humidity. And the walls were as tight as the day they were raised. The chinking had been touched up twice in 30 years, not because it had cracked or fallen out, but because Andrzej was a careful man who maintained his work the way a good farmer maintains his fences, out of principle rather than necessity. The dovetail corners showed no gaps. The log surfaces showed no checks. The wood had developed a deep patina, rich honey brown darkening to almost black in the corners where wood smoke had settled over decades, and the surface was hard enough that a thumbnail left no impression. Andrzej's broad axe marks were still visible on the hewn faces, 30 years of weather having failed to erase the clean, precise strokes that had shaped the logs in the autumn of 1883. The contrast with the other cabins in the valley was stark. By 1913, there were 9 cabins within 2 miles of the covage homestead. The oldest, built in 1871 by a family named Sutter, had been partially rebuilt twice and was on its 3rd set of sill logs. The Farnham cabin, built green in 1879, had been re-chinked 4 times, in 1884, 1889, 1895, and 1906, and had the 6 water-cured replacement logs that Andrzej had helped Farnham install in 1895, which were the only logs in the building that showed no deterioration. Cragg's house, the sawmill owner's own residence, built with his own best lumber in 1866, was 47 years old and looked every year of it. Gray, checked, patched, with visible daylight through 3 joints on the north wall that no amount of re-chinking could permanently seal because the logs were still moving, still adjusting to moisture changes, still behaving the way green-built logs behave for as long as they stand. In 1913, a reporter from the Granite State Monthly, a regional magazine, visited the valley to write a piece about traditional building methods and asked Andrzej about the cabin. Andrzej, now in his mid-70s, showed the reporter the walls. The reporter pressed his thumbnail against the log surface and left no mark. He examined the corners and found no gaps. He looked for checks and found none. He ran his hand along the wall the way Nettie Farnham had run her hand along it 30 years earlier, and felt the same thing Nettie had felt, a surface that was harder and smoother than any cabin wall he had encountered, a surface that felt less like wood and more like stone, like something that had been cured and hardened and would last another 30 years without changing. He asked Andrzej how old the cabin was, and Andrzej told him 30 years, and the reporter did not believe him until Bela produced the deed of homestead with the date of claim and the reporter calculated the years himself and wrote in his notebook that the cabin was 30 years old and looked 10. He wrote in his article that the Covage cabin was the soundest log structure he had examined in 30 years of writing about New England architecture, and he attributed its condition to the water-curing technique that Andrzej described, which the reporter noted was a traditional Bohemian practice unknown in American construction. He described the process in detail: the bark slip felling, the creek submersion, the 13-month cure, the controlled drying. And he noted that the total cost of the technique was $0 beyond the labor of harvesting and handling, and that the result was timber that outperformed commercially dried lumber by every measure. He interviewed Farnham, who showed the reporter his 6 replacement logs and described the difference between the water-cured logs and the green originals. He interviewed Cragg, who admitted that his premium air-dried lumber was an improvement over green lumber, but was not in the same category as what the creek produced. The reporter took photographs of the Covage cabin, of the tight corners, of the smooth wall surface, of the creek bend where the logs had cured, and he submitted the article with a recommendation that the State Agricultural Extension Service investigate water curing as a potential improvement for rural construction. The article was published in the spring of 1914. It was read by the small audience of the Granite State Monthly, farmers, tradespeople, and local history enthusiasts in New Hampshire, and it was forgotten within the year. The State Agricultural Extension Service did not investigate. No lumber company adopted the technique. No building manual incorporated it. Water-cured timber did not enter American building practice because the American building industry in 1914 was moving toward milled dimensional lumber, standard framing, and rapid construction, and a technique that required leaving logs in a creek for a year was incompatible with everything the industry was becoming. Speed won, patience lost. And the knowledge that had kept Bohemian farmhouses sound for centuries, and one New Hampshire cabin, tight for 30 years, disappeared into the archive of a regional magazine that almost no one read. The homesteaders who adopted it in the valley above Alder Run benefited from it for decades, but the knowledge did not spread beyond the valley. By the 1930s, the younger generation had moved to towns and factory work. The cabins that remained standing were occupied by aging families who remembered Andrzej's technique but had no one to teach it to. The creek still ran cold and clear through the valley. The deep bend where the curing logs had sat was still there. The gravel bottom smooth, the current gentle. But no logs lay in the water. No one was waiting 13 months for timber that would last 30 years because no one was building with logs anymore, and the men who understood what the water did to the wood were old and growing older, and their knowledge lived in their hands and not in any book. When the last generation of settlers who remembered Andrzej Covage passed away, the technique passed with them. The Covage cabin itself stood into the 1940s, still tight, still sound, the dovetail corners unmoved, the water-cured logs as hard and dark as the day the reporter had pressed his thumbnail against them and left no mark. 60 years old and still standing, while cabins half its age had rotted and fallen. Eventually it was abandoned, and eventually it collapsed. Not from rot or structural failure, but from a fallen hemlock that crushed the roof during a storm. The walls were intact when the tree hit them. The water-cured logs, after 6 decades of New Hampshire weather, had outlasted the forest itself. But the principle has not changed. Wood still has a memory. Green logs still check. Sap still feeds insects and fungi. Water curing still works the way it worked in the Šumava, the way it worked in the creek above Alder Run, the way it would work today if anyone had the patience to fell a tree and put it in the water and wait a year before building with it. The chemistry is the same. The physics is the same. The only thing that has changed is the willingness to wait. Andrei Kovács did not invent water curing. His father did not invent it. Nobody in living memory invented it. Somebody, a long time ago, in a forest in Bohemia, noticed that logs pulled from a river built better than logs pulled from a hillside, and they told their neighbor, and the neighbor tried it, and it worked, and the knowledge passed from hand to hand across centuries until a man named Andrei carried it in his memory across an ocean and sank his logs in a creek in New Hampshire, while his neighbors shook their heads and said the wood was ruined. And then 30 winters came and went, and his cabin stood tight while theirs did not. No myths, no miracles, just water, tannin, and the patience of a creek.